I'm 72 years old. Saying it out loud still sounds strange, as if age carries a greater weight than the years themselves. For a long time, I thought that getting older meant just accepting, lowering your head, and moving on in silence. Today I realize that, along with the years, there has also been a late clarity, one of those that do not ask permission to arrive. For almost my entire life, I believed what I was told about who I was supposed to be. I believed it was normal. I believed it was love. It took me decades to understand that it wasn't. I spent much of my existence trying to fit into expectations that were never mine. I learned early on to observe the environment before speaking, to measure words, to feel the atmosphere of the house as if feeling the change of weather. I adjusted, molded, cringed when I realized that my presence could bother me. It wasn't something anyone needed to say clearly. It was learned in silence, in looks, in small daily corrections that seemed harmless, but that accumulated inside me. For many years, I confused pleasing with loving. I believed that if I was easy, understanding, and always available, I would be doing the right thing. When something hurt me, I told myself that it was overkill, that other people were going through worse. This thought accompanied me like a discreet shadow, always ready to remind me that my pains did not deserve much space. Thus, I became small on the inside, even as I grew up on the outside. There were times when I felt like saying no, to disagree, to simply be honest about what I felt. But these desires were accompanied by a fear that was difficult to explain. Fear of disappointing, of being seen as ungrateful, of causing discomfort. So I would swallow the words, take a deep breath, and move on. Over time, this gesture became automatic, almost invisible even to myself. I no longer realized how much I was canceling myself. I look back and see a sequence of choices that seemed natural, but that I now know were guided more by fear than desire. I got married, built a family, fulfilled roles that were expected of me with dedication. On the outside, everything seemed correct, even admirable. Inside, there was a constant tiredness, as if I was always trying to keep something in balance, even without knowing exactly what. It was a silent, continuous effort which no one noticed. I was often told that I was strong, and I believed that too. Being strong became an obligation, an identity that I could not abandon. Strong people don't complain, they don't hesitate, they don't set limits. Strong people can handle it. And I did. I took care of everything they asked of me, but I almost never took care of myself. Only now do I realize how much this force was, in fact, a form of survival. Over the years, I left parts of myself along the way. Tastes, opinions, small dreams were left for later, for a calmer moment that never came. I said that it made no difference, that it was not important. Today, I know I did. Each time I was silent, something in me moved a little further away. It wasn't all at once, it was gradually, with almost no immediate pain, but with a deep and lasting effect. Reaching old age brought silence, a silence different from that of childhood. Now, the house is quiet, the days are slower, and there is time to think. It is in this space that the questions began to arise. Insistent. Who would I have been if I had allowed myself to truly exist? At what point did I accept that pleasing was more important than being? These questions do not come to accuse, they come to reveal. For a long time, I believed that this type of reflection was no longer useful for anything. I thought that certain discoveries only make sense when there is still time to change everything. Today, I understand that this was also a lie that I accepted. Even late, understanding has value. Even now, seeing the truth changes how I see myself and how I look at the past I carried with me. This is not a story of big explosions or dramatic gestures. It is the story of a prolonged silence, of a constant adaptation, of a whole life lived outwards. Telling this now is perhaps the first gesture I make just for myself. Not to please, not to justify, but to exist, albeit belatedly, with a little more honesty. When I say I'm 72 years old, I'm not just talking about age. I talk about the weight of everything I accepted without questioning, and the strange lightness that begins to emerge when I stop pretending that everything was fine. This is my voice, finally without rehearsal. And this is the story of how it took me a lifetime to start using it. The fact that you're here, listening to this story so far, says a lot about your sensitivity and attention to what really matters. What I'm going to share next isn't just personal. It's a truth that crosses many lifetimes in silence. If you believe that stories like this deserve to continue to be told, subscribe to the channel, because this support is what keeps these voices alive. I learned early on not to bother, although no one has ever sat down with me to teach it clearly. It was a silent learning, built little by little, indoors, observing more than listening. I was born into a simple family, where everything worked better when no one asked too many questions. There was no constant shouting or great drama, but there was an invisible rule. Everyone should take their place and not cross limits that were never explained. The house where I grew up was small, organized, and carried a kind of silence that wasn't exactly peace. It was an attentive, almost vigilant silence. I paid attention to the tone of voice of the adults, the noise of the pots, the way the door was closed. I learned to realize when it was better to be quiet and when it was safe to say something. This care became part of me even before I was old enough to understand why. My parents were not bad people. They did what they knew, the way they learned. But feelings were not a common subject, and childish opinions were rarely taken into account. When I tried to express something that sounded like a complaint, there was always some answer that taught me to back off. They said that I was too sensitive, that I needed to learn to be grateful, that there were more important things than what I felt at that moment. I grew up believing that my emotions were an unnecessary nuisance. If I was sad, it was better to disguise it. If she was upset, swallow it. Not because someone ordered it, but because I realized that everything flowed better that way. The house was quieter, the adults less tense, and I learned to value this tranquility above any desire of mine. At school, this behavior accompanied me. I was the student who didn't give me trouble, who accepted instructions without question. When something seemed unfair to me, I would think twice before speaking. I didn't want to attract attention. I didn't want to be seen as difficult. It was easier to adapt than to face the discomfort of being different. And little by little, I came to believe that this was a virtue. There were times when I felt angry, of course. Children also feel it. But I didn't know what to do with that feeling. It did not seem appropriate to demonstrate it. So it was stored, compressed somewhere inside me, without a name, without space. Over time, I got good at ignoring these sensations, as if they weren't important enough to be heard. I remember sitting at the table and watching others talk, decide, laugh. I was there, present, but always one step behind. If they asked me something, I answered what I thought they expected to hear. It wasn't exactly a lie. It was adaptation. I shaped my answers to keep everything in order. It gave me a strange sense of security, as if I was doing the right thing. No one told me I needed to erase myself, but no one showed me that I could fully exist either. The example I had was clear. Loved ones were those who didn't create problems, and I wanted to be wanted. I wanted to be accepted. I wanted to belong. So I learned to reduce my gestures, my words, my desires, until everything fit into a small and controlled space. Over the years, this way of being is no longer a conscious choice. It has become automatic. I didn't think anymore before I shut up. I just kept quiet. I didn't think about whether I wanted something different, I just accepted it. It was like breathing, natural, invisible, constant. And the more I did that, the less I knew where other people's worlds ended and mine began. Today, looking back, I realized that this early learning shaped my entire life. Learning not to bother was the first step to learning to cancel myself. At the time, it seemed just education, respect, maturity. But there was a hidden price there, a price that I only began to see many years later. This girl I was believed that silence was protection, and in a way, it was. But it was also prison, a slowly built prison, with no visible bars, where I myself learned to lock the door from the inside. Understanding this now hurts, but it also clarifies, because everything that came after started there, in this simple and deep learning that it was better not to take up too much space. Over time, I came to understand that love, in my life, never came alone. He always arrived accompanied by rules, even if no one announced them out loud. To love meant to correspond, to adjust, not to contradict. I felt affection, yes, but he always seemed conditioned by my behavior. When I did everything right, there was approval. When he demonstrated something different, silence or correction disguised as advice came. I learned to observe when affection approached and when it moved away. One wrong gesture, one answer out of tune, and the mood changed. It wasn't explicit punishment, it was something more subtle, but enough to make me alert. So I started to associate love with constant attention to the other. To be liked, I needed to always be available, always understanding, always ready to give in. I convinced myself that this was normal. I saw other women around me doing the same, annulling wills in the name of harmony. They said that relationship was just like that no one could want everything. And I believed it. I believed that to love was to give in almost always, to be silent often, and to accept as a virtue what diminished me inside. There were times when I felt a tightness that was difficult to explain. It was not clear sadness nor assumed anger. It was a feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't point out what. When this discomfort arose, I immediately pushed him away. I thought it was selfishness on my part, lack of gratitude, immaturity. I learned to distrust my own feelings. The more I tried to be kind, the more I moved away from myself. I said yes when I wanted to say no. I agreed when something bothered me. I did this to maintain affection, so as not to lose the place I was given. And, little by little, I understood that this place only existed as long as I fulfilled certain expectations. No one directly threatened me with the loss of love, but I felt that it had limits. And these limits were non-negotiable. If I overtook it, something would break. So I kept myself inside them, carefully, almost afraid. This fear became a constant companion, although I rarely recognized it as such. I praised, supported, understood. He made an effort to be easy to get along with. When something hurt me, I justified the other. There was always a reasonable explanation for me swallowing what I felt. And so I learned to love without demanding, without asking, without expecting much in return. Over the years, this pattern has deepened. It was no longer just in the family, but in all relationships. I believed that I needed to deserve affection, to constantly prove that I was worthy of it. Resting, complaining, or simply disagreeing seemed like too big a risk. So I kept molding myself, believing that this was the price of love. Today I realize how much it distorted my view of myself. I started to see myself through the eyes of others, through how much I could please. My value was always linked to my emotional usefulness. If I was needed, I was wanted. If I failed, I feared I would be discarded. This logic has accompanied me for decades. There were times when I thought about breaking away from it, but the idea of losing affection was too scary. I would rather lose a little of myself than lose the bond. This choice, repeated so many times, emptied me without me realizing it. I still smiled, it still worked, but something essential was kept, untouched. To say that love came with conditions is something I can only say now. At the time, I called it care, commitment, maturity. I now know that love should not require constant silence or continual annulment, but this understanding took time. It took a lifetime of being molded to finally begin to see. This chapter of my story has no clear villains or extreme gestures. There is only the daily repetition of small concessions that have become permanent. And it was like this, accepting conditions that I never questioned, that I continued to believe that to love was to diminish myself a little more every day. It was in my youth that I was asked something I didn't want, even though at the time, I didn't have the courage or words to call it a refusal. They didn't ask me what I felt. They just explained what needed to be done. They said it in a calm, almost careful tone, as if they were protecting me from a bigger mistake. I listened in silence, trying to understand why my chest tightened so much while everyone else seemed so right. I remember thinking that maybe I was exaggerating, that discomfort was just fear of the new, insecurity of those who still didn't know how the world worked. That's what they told me too, that it was normal to feel doubt, that later I would be grateful, that it was for my good. When such a phrase is repeated by adults we trust, it gains weight of absolute truth. There were no shouts or violent impositions. There was expectation, looks that awaited my agreement, an environment in which saying no seemed to break something important. I felt that if I refused, I would be disappointing people who said they loved me. And disappointing has always been something I learned to avoid, almost as an instinct. At that moment, I realized that my desire didn't have much value. He was small compared to what others considered right. So I did what I always knew how to do best. I adjusted. I said yes in a trembling voice, trying to convince myself that it wasn't so serious. I said yes, hoping that over time I would get used to it. What struck me the most was not the decision itself, but what came along with it. Silence came. The subject was no longer talked about. It was as if, after my consent, there was no more room for doubt or regret. I learned that once I said yes, there was no going back. Questioning later would be a sign of weakness or ingratitude. The phrases echo in my memory to this day. That's just how it is. Everyone goes through this. You'll understand over time. Each of them helped normalize what I felt was wrong, and little by little, I began to doubt myself. If everyone said it was normal, maybe the problem was with me. It was there that something changed definitively. I learned that my discomfort could be ignored if it was disrupting the order of things, that my wishes were negotiable, as long as others were satisfied. That lesson settled deep, shaping how I would handle future decisions. I didn't cry that day. I didn't make a scene. I just accepted. And this silent acceptance was interpreted as maturity. They said I was being responsible, sensible, adult. I heard these compliments and felt a strange pride, mixed with a sadness that I could not explain. It was as if I had lost something, but I didn't know exactly what. As time went by, I stopped thinking of that moment as something isolated. He became a reference. Whenever a difficult situation arose, I remembered. I survived that. I can survive this anymore. And so I accumulated concessions, each one reinforcing the idea that resisting was not worth it. Today I understand that that request marked the beginning of a long sequence. Not because it was the worst moment of my life, but because it taught me to give in even when everything in me said no. It taught me that pleasing was safer than trusting my own voice. It took me many years to look at this episode without blaming myself. For a long time, I thought I should have been stronger, firmer. Now I know that I did what I knew how to do to survive emotionally in that context. It doesn't erase the pain, but it changes the way I see myself. That day did not end with great immediate consequences. Life went on, but something in me closed in a little more. And it was like this, accepting what I didn't want, that I learned to move even further away from who I was, believing that this was the right way to go. After that moment when I accepted what I didn't want, being quiet started to seem like the simplest choice. It wasn't exactly a conscious decision, but an automatic reaction. Whenever something bothered me, I remembered the weight I felt trying to resist, and the strange relief that came when I kept silent. The silence, although heavy, seemed less risky than the confrontation. I began to realize that when I didn't question, everything flowed better around me. People were calmer, situations were resolved faster, and I received compliments for being understanding. This reinforced the idea that being quiet was a quality, something that made me easier to deal with. Little by little, I associated external harmony with internal annulment. Whenever a difficult situation arose, I already knew what my role would be. I listened, agreed, accepted. Even when something hurt, I preferred to keep it to myself. I told myself that it was not worth creating problems because of this. This phrase repeated itself in my head like a mantra, helping to justify each new silence. There were days when I felt like talking, expressing what I really thought. At those times, my body reacted even before my mind. My heart raced, my throat closed, and a sense of alertness washed over me. It was like I was about to do something wrong, so I backed off. He always retreated. Over time, I realized that I didn't even need someone silencing me anymore. I did it alone. I anticipated reactions, imagined disapproval, created scenarios in which my speech would cause discomfort. And to avoid all this, I simply did not speak. This constant self-control made me tired, but it felt necessary. People started to see me as someone calm, balanced, who never changed. I heard these comments and smiled, even though I knew that calm had a high price. Inside, I accumulated feelings that could not find a way out. But as I never exploded, no one noticed what was being kept. Staying quiet also gave me the feeling of being in control. As long as I said nothing, nothing could be used against me. I avoided arguments, judgments, conflicts. It was a protection strategy that worked in the short term, but that, little by little, took me away from myself. There were times when I tried to break this pattern by saying something that bothered me, but the reactions I received reinforced my fear. Sometimes there was surprise, sometimes impatience. I interpreted this as a sign that I had done something wrong. Then I would return to silence, even more convinced that this was where I should stay. Over the years, this habit has become part of my identity. I no longer knew how to differentiate what was adaptation from what was erasure. Everything seemed to be mixed. I believed I was being mature, when in fact I was just hiding. But admitting it back then was unthinkable. Today I see that being quiet seemed easier because speaking would require facing difficult truths. Truths about how dissatisfied I was, about how much I had given in, about how much I was afraid of losing approval. Silence spared me from these confrontations, even if it cost me dearly. This chapter of my life does not have a single major event. It is made up of small silences repeated every day. Silences that added up, accumulated, and created an empty space inside me. A space that, for a long time, I didn't even know how to name. That's how I moved on, believing that being quiet was a sign of strength and maturity. It was only much later that I began to understand that by always choosing silence, I was giving up on myself. And this resignation, although discreet, was one of the most profound I have made. I got married without knowing exactly who I was, but believing that it was part of the natural path of life. I didn't question it too much. I didn't reflect deeply on my desires. The decisions already seemed to be made before I even thought of alternatives. They said that this was how things worked, that time would put everything in place. I trusted. I always trusted more what was expected of me than what I felt. Marriage emerged as another logical step, almost inevitable. I don't remember choosing clearly, but I did go with the flow. There was affection, there was respect, but there was also a constant sense of adaptation. I observed, learned what pleased, what avoided conflict, and shaped my behavior based on that. It was something so natural to me that I hardly realized the effort involved. I took on the role that was due to me with dedication. I learned to care, to organize, to support. I always put the needs of the other ahead of my own, convinced that this was love. When doubts or discomforts arose, I kept them. I thought it was like that for everyone, that no one lived exactly as they wanted. This idea helped me move forward without questioning too much. Over time, I became an expert in perceiving the humor of others. He knew when to speak, when to be silent, when to give in. This constant care made me tired, but I didn't recognize tiredness as a problem. I saw it as part of the responsibility to keep everything running. And while everything seemed fine on the outside, I believed I was fulfilling my role. There were times when I missed something I didn't know how to name. It was a vague feeling, as if I was living someone else's life, but I quickly pushed that thought away. I told myself that it was ingratitude to feel this when so many things were seemingly in place. So I smiled, followed, and pushed any questions for later. Gradually, I moved further away from myself. My opinions started to be filtered even before they emerged. My desires were postponed indefinitely. I adapted so much that I no longer knew how to distinguish what was choice and what was habit. Everything seemed to be mixed, and I had no parameters to realize that something was wrong. People around me saw a stable marriage, a devoted woman, someone who could be trusted. I heard compliments and felt a quiet pride, but also a slowly growing emptiness. It was as if I was always playing a role, without ever leaving the scene. And the more time passed, the harder it seemed to imagine any other way to live. When the children arrived, this movement intensified. My needs became even more distant. Everything revolved around caring, protecting, emotionally supporting. I convinced myself that this was my mission, and that thinking of myself would be selfish. Thus, I was erasing myself with even more conviction, believing that I was doing what was right. Today, I understand that I didn't enter the marriage being who I was, because I hadn't had the chance to discover it yet. I was already molded, trained to please, ready to occupy the space that was offered to me. There was no room for questions, only for adaptation. And I adapted, as I always did. I don't tell this with anger, but with a clarity that only time has brought. I got married without knowing who I was because I was never taught that I could be someone by myself. I learned to be a wife, a caregiver, a support. I just didn't learn to be me. And this absence, although silent, accompanied me for many years. This chapter of my life seems ordinary at first glance. Nothing extraordinary happened. But it was there that the erasure was consolidated. It was there that I confirmed, without realizing it, that my function was to fit, support, and follow. And it was like this, living outside, that I continued walking, still far from the woman I could have been. At some point in my life, being strong stopped being a choice and became a silent obligation. I don't remember exactly when this happened. I just know that suddenly, everyone expected me to be able to handle it, to take care of the house, the emotions of others, the problems that arose without warning. And I did. I always did. Not because it was easy, but because there seemed to be no alternative. People started to turn to me naturally, to listen, to advise, to solve. I became the safe place of others, the one that doesn't fall apart, that doesn't complain, that endures. And the more I corresponded to that image, the more it solidified. Being strong became part of my identity, something I couldn't abandon without disappointing those who trusted me. I rarely talked about my own tiredness. When someone asked if everything was okay, I answered yes, almost automatically. Sometimes I didn't even realize I was lying. I truly believed that what I felt wasn't as important as what others needed. My pain seemed too small to take up space. There was constant pressure to keep everything running. If something went out of place, I felt that the responsibility was mine. If someone was sad, I tried to help. If there was tension, I mediated. This continuous effort left me exhausted, but I didn't recognize exhaustion as a warning sign. I saw it as part of duty. Being strong also meant not showing fragility. Cry in silence, feel in silence, endure in silence. I learned to smile even when it was empty. I learned to say, it's okay, even when I wasn't. And the more I did that, the harder it became to admit any need of mine. Over time, I came to believe that asking for help was a sign of weakness, that showing doubt was dangerous. So I kept everything. It created an appearance of stability that hid an increasingly heavy inner world. People praised my strength, not realizing how much it cost me. There were times when I felt like stopping, saying that I couldn't do it anymore. But these desires were accompanied by guilt. I thought about who would be helpless if I backed down, who would be disappointed. And so, once again, I put myself in the background, believing that this was the right thing to do. Being strong has become armor. On the outside, she protected me. Inside, I isolated myself. I didn't know what it would be like to remove this layer, or if there was still something underneath it. The constant strength kept me away from the possibility of being cared for, of being welcomed, of simply being human. Today, I realize that no one directly forced me to carry everything alone. I accepted this role because it was familiar, because it pleased, because it kept everything under control. But the price was high. I carried weights that were not mine alone, while my own needs were forgotten. Being strong, the way I learned, didn't make me stronger. It just silenced me even more. And understanding this now is painful, but necessary, because this obligation that I had embraced for so long was one of the most effective ways to get away from myself. This chapter marks the peak of my erasure. I was whole to the world, but absent to myself. And while everyone saw a resistant woman, I began to lose sight of myself, not knowing when or how it had happened. Guilt has always been present in my life, even when I didn't know exactly where it came from. It was a constant, discreet, but persistent sensation, like a musical background that never stopped. I felt guilty for thinking about myself, guilty for getting tired, guilty for wanting something different from what I had. Even in the moments when everything seemed to be fine, guilt found a way to appear. When something didn't work out, my first impulse was to look at myself. He asked where I had failed, what I could have done better, at what point I missed something. I rarely considered that perhaps not everything was under my control. Taking the blame was almost automatic, as if it were my responsibility to keep everything in order. In marriage, motherhood, family relationships, guilt infiltrated every decision. If I felt unfulfilled, I thought it was ingratitude. If I felt sad, I thought I didn't have enough reasons. There was always someone in a worse situation, someone with more difficulties. I used this as an argument to silence any discomfort of mine. Over the years, this guilt has shaped my choices. I avoided saying no so as not to feel selfish. He avoided asking for help so as not to bother him. She avoided resting so as not to look lazy. Everything in me seemed to need justification, as if existing was already an excess that I needed to compensate. There was also the guilt of not feeling what I thought I should feel. Sometimes I wondered why I wasn't fully satisfied with the life I had. After all, I had done everything right. I followed the expected path, fulfilled my duties, did not cause major conflicts. Even so, something was missing, and for that, I blamed myself even more. That guilt wasn't loud. It did not come in the form of clear accusations. It was silent, constant, infiltrated in everyday thoughts. It appeared when I tried to relax, when I thought about changing something, when I considered putting my feelings first. There was always an inner voice reminding me of all that I owed to others. I believed that this guilt was part of being a good person, that feeling guilty meant having awareness, responsibility, maturity. It never occurred to me that it could be an unfair burden, something learned and reinforced over the years. For me, it was just who I was. In many moments, I tried to talk to myself, trying to relieve this feeling. He said that everything was fine, that I had done my best. But these words rarely held up for long. Guilt always found a way to come back, stronger, more convincing. It also prevented me from looking back with compassion. I charged myself for not having been different, for not having reacted, for not having realized it before. I didn't see the young woman I was as someone trying to survive emotionally, but as someone who failed to impose herself. This harsh vision has accompanied me for decades. Only much later did I begin to realize that this guilt was not born with me. It was being built, fed by expectations, silences, and demands that were never mine. But coming to that conclusion took time and courage, because it meant reviewing everything I believed about myself. Meanwhile, the guilt was still there, firm, shaping my days and nights. She kept me in the known place, preventing any movement toward myself. It was safer to carry this weight than to question its origin. This chapter of my life was marked by this constant presence. The guilt never went away, but it began to become visible. And when something becomes visible, it no longer has the same power. Without even realizing it, I was starting to take the first step to understand that not all of that was really mine to carry. Over the years, I became invisible in a very specific way. I was always present, always available, but rarely seen for real. People around me believed I was okay, because I never said otherwise. I smiled, helped, participated. And, as there were no complaints, no one suspected the silence I carried inside. I also didn't make it easy for them to notice. When someone asked how I was, the answer came ready, automatic. All right. This phrase came out so naturally that it seemed true even to me. I didn't want to worry anyone. I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want to make room for questions that maybe I didn't know how to answer. So I would close the door before anyone even approached. There were times when I wished someone would notice, that I would notice the fatigue in my eyes, the absence in my words, the weight in my gestures. But this desire was accompanied by shame. I thought that if no one noticed, it was because it wasn't that serious. And if it wasn't serious, I had no right to complain. Silence became a tacit agreement between me and the world. I didn't talk, and no one asked too much. Everyone seemed comfortable with this dynamic. I was the person who didn't demand, didn't create conflicts. This role guaranteed me a place, but it was an empty place, where I needed to leave important parts of myself outside. In many situations, I was surrounded by people, and yet I felt alone. The conversations passed me by without really touching me. I listened to stories, problems, opinions, but I rarely shared mine. Not for lack of will, but for not knowing how to start. Talking about myself seemed strange, almost inappropriate. I also convinced myself that no one would understand, that if I tried to explain what I felt, it would sound confusing, exaggerated, or unjustified. So I didn't even try. I kept everything inside me, organizing emotions in silent compartments, where no one else had access. It was tiring, but it felt safer. Over time, this lack of speech created distance even in the closest relationships. I was there, but not completely. People knew my routine, my responsibilities, but not my deepest feelings. And as I never expressed them, they became more and more distant, even to myself. There have been occasions when something has escaped, a loose phrase, a heavier sigh. But soon I corrected, changed the subject, minimized it. I didn't want to cause discomfort or open a conversation that could get out of control. The silence, although heavy, was predictable. Talking seemed too risky. I also believed that too much time had passed to start talking. I thought that, after so many years, it didn't make sense to bring up old feelings. I told myself that it was better to leave everything as it was. This idea kept me stuck, preventing any movement toward change. Today, I understand that no one noticed because I didn't allow myself to be noticed. And I didn't speak because I learned that speaking up was too costly. This combination created a quiet loneliness, difficult to explain but deeply present. A loneliness lived in the midst of people. This chapter of my life was not marked by major ruptures, but by a constant absence. The absence of my voice, of my truth, of my entire presence. And the more time I spent like this, the more distant I became from myself, believing that this was the only possible way to exist. When I look back, I see that silence protected me at times, but it also robbed me of many others. He kept me safe, but he kept me imprisoned. And it was living like this, without being noticed and without speaking, that I reached the stage of life in which silence began to weigh more than the fear of breaking it. There came a time when my body started saying what I never said out loud. It was not suddenly, nor dramatically. It was gradually, like everything else in my life. A tiredness that did not go away with rest, a lack of energy that I could not explain. I woke up tired and went to sleep even more exhausted, as if carrying the day had become too heavy. At first, I ignored it. I told myself that it was age, that it was normal to feel the weight of the years. There was always a practical explanation for what I felt. I didn't want to connect it to something deeper, because that would require looking within, and looking inside still scared me. Over time, the body insisted. There came diffuse pain, a tightness in the chest and moments of tension, a constant feeling of being overwhelmed even when nothing seemed out of place. I continued to function, fulfilling my tasks, but with less lightness. Each movement required more effort than before. There were days when I just didn't feel like getting out of bed. It wasn't clear sadness, it was a deep exhaustion. I got up anyway, because I always did. He did what needed to be done, even if inside something was asking for a break. I ignored this request, as I ignored so many others throughout my life. I realized that my body reacted especially when I needed to shut up once again. In situations where I wanted to say something and didn't, I felt a not form. In meetings where I annulled myself, there was a strange, almost physical weight. It was as if my body was trying to compensate for the absence of my voice. People around me commented that I looked tired. I smiled and nodded, saying that it was a thing of age. I didn't want to go deeper. I didn't want to turn that into a subject. But deep down, I knew there was something else going on. Something that could not be solved with rest or medicine. For the first time, I began to suspect that perhaps the problem was not only in the body, that perhaps he was reacting to years of silence, of restraint, of striving to fit in. This idea scared me, because it called into question everything I had considered normal until then. Even so, I resisted this conclusion for a while. It was difficult to accept that what I called strength could have made me sick. I preferred to think that it was just natural wear and tear. To admit otherwise meant to acknowledge that I had ignored important signals for too long. There was a specific day when I realized that I couldn't fake it anymore. It wasn't a big event, just a simple moment when my body failed in something every day. There, I clearly felt that something needed to change, even if I didn't know what. For the first time, the silence no longer seemed bearable. That was a quiet turning point. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't make announcements. But something inside me started to move. The body, which had always carried the weight silently, was finally demanding attention. And I, even though I was afraid, began to listen. Understanding that my body spoke for me was painful, but also enlightening. He was expressing everything that I didn't allow to come out of my mouth. Every pain, every tiredness, every limit crossed was a message that I could no longer ignore. Today I see this chapter as a late warning, but necessary. The body began to speak when my voice was still stuck, and it was from this sign that the possibility of change began to take shape, still timid, but real. For the first time, something in me said that continuing in the same way was no longer an option. What changed everything was not something grandiose, nor planned. There was no announcement, no preparation. It was a small detail, almost insignificant in the eyes of anyone else. Something that could have gone unnoticed on an ordinary day, but it did not pass. That detail found in me a ground already too tired to continue pretending that everything was fine. I was alone at home when this happened. The silence was familiar, but that day he seemed different, more attentive. While rummaging through an old drawer, I found something I hadn't seen in years. A simple object, kept unintentionally, forgotten among things that have lost their usefulness. As I held it, I felt an unexpected tightness in my chest, as if it had touched a part of me that was asleep. That took me back in time. I remembered the person I was before I learned to shut up so much, before accepting everything as it came, before believing that pleasing was the only way to stay safe. The memory did not come with joy, but with a deep sadness, the kind that does not make noise, but takes care of everything. I sat slowly, holding that object as if it could run away. For the first time in many years, I allowed memories to come without trying to control them. Memories came of interrupted wills, of unchosen paths, of words that were never spoken. Everything I pushed away started to approach at once. The strongest thing was not remembering what happened, but realizing how much I normalized everything, how I accepted ready-made explanations, how I convinced myself that it was really like that. The phrase, "it wasn't my fault," came up for the first time, shy, almost whispered. And just thinking about it, something inside me was shaken. I always believed that if something hurt, it was because I hadn't been strong enough. But at that moment, this idea began to lose strength. For the first time, I considered that perhaps I had done the best I could with what I had. That maybe that young woman, I was not weak, but just trapped in a context that didn't allow real choices. This thought scared me and relieved me at the same time. It was scary because it dismantled a narrative that had accompanied me for decades. It relieved me because it took a huge weight off my shoulders. If it wasn't my fault, then I didn't have to punish myself so much anymore. This possibility opened a crack of light where before there was only silence. I stayed there for a long time, doing nothing, just feeling. I didn't try to organize emotions, nor to find quick conclusions. I let everything exist, even confusing, even painful. It was the first time I had done this without correcting myself, without rushing to get back in control. That simple detail turned into a mirror. He showed me who I was, who I became, and who maybe I could still be. It did not bring ready-made answers, but it did bring new questions. Questions that I had never allowed to arise before. I realized that this moment did not require immediate action. It was not the time for confrontations or external changes. It was time to look inward with honesty, to recognize losses without minimizing, to accept pain without justifying. This in itself was already a quiet revolution. The most impressive thing was to realize that even with all the pain that came with it, I didn't feel like running away. For the first time, I stayed. I stayed with me. I endured looking at what I had always avoided. And that showed me that something, finally, had changed. That detail didn't solve my life, but it opened my eyes. It marked the beginning of a belated, but inevitable, awakening. From then on, I could no longer pretend not to see. Something inside me had woken up. And even though I didn't know what to do with it, I knew, after that day, I wouldn't be the same. What comes now is the hardest part for me. To speak of this means to let go of the silence that has protected me for a lifetime, and to accept the weight of what has been lost. If you have come this far, it is because you understand that certain truths are too expensive to keep. So I ask you, sign up, not as support, but as a way to preserve that voice, so that it doesn't disappear again. After that day, something changed quietly but profoundly. For the first time in a long time, a thought arose without being immediately corrected. Maybe I wasn't to blame. This idea did not come as a certainty, but as a fragile possibility, almost forbidden. Even so, she settled on me and refused to leave. I spent days reflecting on this, reliving moments from the past in a new light. Situations that I previously interpreted as my failures began to take on another meaning. I no longer saw only the woman who gave in, but the young woman who did what was possible within the limitations she had. This change of gaze was uncomfortable, but also liberating. Guilt has always been my starting point. Any memory was accompanied by judgment. This time, I tried something different. Instead of accusing me, I watched myself. Instead of charging myself, I tried to understand. It was strange at first, like learning a new language after a lifetime of speaking another. There was resistance. At various times, guilt tried to regain its place. I found myself thinking that I was being too indulgent with myself, that I was making excuses. But little by little, I realized that this voice was old, known, trained over the years. It wasn't the truth, it was habit. For the first time, I was able to separate responsibility from guilt. I understood that making choices did not mean carrying eternal shame. I made choices, yes, but many of them were made in contexts where saying no was not a real option. Acknowledging this did not erase the past, but made it more human. This process was neither quick nor linear. There were days when I moved forward, others when I went back. But something essential had changed. I no longer automatically accepted guilt as absolute truth. I began to question it, to observe it from the outside, as something that had accompanied me for a long time, but that no longer needed to command me. With that, old feelings began to reorganize. The sadness gained clearer contours. The anger, which I had always avoided, appeared in a discreet but honest way, not as an explosion, but as an acknowledgement of silent injustices. Allowing these feelings was scary, but also necessary. I realized that blaming myself was always a way to keep everything under control. If it was my fault, then the world made sense. Taking the blame away from the center messed up this logic, but it made room for something new, a space where I could exist without having to justify myself all the time. I started to look at myself with a little more kindness. It wasn't indulgence, it was respect. For the first time, I felt that I deserved understanding, including from myself. This idea, simple at first glance, was one of the most difficult to accept throughout my life. This new look has not changed what I have experienced, but it has changed how it lives in me. The memories were still there, but less sharp. The weight has decreased, not because everything was resolved, but because I stopped carrying alone a guilt that was never mine alone. By not blaming myself, I began to make room for something that I had always lacked, the possibility of choice. Even if late, even if small, guilt kept me stuck in the past. Without it, the present seemed less suffocating. This chapter did not mark the end of pain, but it marked the beginning of understanding. For the first time, I was able to look at my history without condemning myself. And that, more than any answer, was the beginning of the freedom I never thought I could still feel. After relieving the guilt, something even more difficult came: understanding what was taken from me. I am not talking about material things, nor about specific opportunities that I can list clearly. I'm talking about something deeper, quieter. I talk about the time when I didn't know myself, the choices that never became choices, the voice that was kept for so long that it was almost lost. At first, I resisted this idea. To think that something was taken away from me seemed like exaggeration, dramatization. I was always taught not to put myself as a victim, to accept what came with dignity. But little by little, I realized that recognizing a loss is not the same as denying responsibility. It's just naming what happened. I understood that I was taken away from the possibility of experimenting, to err on my own, to test limits, to discover who I was without constant fear of disapproval. Instead, I learned to adjust before I even tried. This saved me conflicts, but it also robbed me of experiences that never come back. I realized that I was taken away from the right to say no without guilt. Every time I accepted something to avoid tension, I left a piece of myself behind. At the time, it seemed like a small price to pay. Today, I see the size of the sum of these small losses. They accumulated and shaped a lifetime. I was also stripped of confidence in myself. I learned to doubt my perceptions, to seek validation outside before trusting what I felt. When this happens for many years, the person begins to move away from their own intuition, and without it, everything is more difficult. There were times when I felt angry when I realized this. Not an explosive anger, but a firm, quiet pain, a belated indignation for having accepted so much without questioning. This anger scared me at first because I never allowed myself to feel it, but I understood that she had an important role, to show that something was unfair. At the same time, I felt sadness, a deep sadness for what I didn't live, for the versions of me that never existed. Allowing this sadness was difficult, because I always learned to minimize losses. But this time, I didn't minimize it. I let it exist in no hurry to pass. I understood that what was taken from me cannot be returned in the same way. Time does not come back. Circumstances change. But acknowledging this loss has given me something new. Clarity. Clarity about why I feel empty at certain times, even though I did everything right. This understanding has also changed the way I see my story. No longer as a sequence of personal failures, but as the result of an environment that taught me to silence myself. This does not erase my choices, but contextualizes. And that makes all the difference. When I understood what was taken from me, I stopped asking myself only what I did wrong. I started to wonder what I lacked, and that question made room for compassion, something I've always offered to others but rarely to myself. This chapter did not bring immediate relief. On the contrary, it brought a clearer, more conscious pain. But it was an honest pain. And for the first time, I felt that I was dealing with the truth, not with versions softened to fit the expectations of others. Understanding what was taken from me was an essential step to stop diminishing myself, because only when we recognize a loss can we decide what can still be built, even late. When I realized all this, many people could expect an external confrontation, a difficult conversation, late accusations, explanations that never came. But none of this happened, not because I had no motives, but because I understood that the most important confrontation was not with others, it was with myself. I spent years imagining what I would say if I had the courage, rehearsing phrases that never left my mouth. But at that point in my life, I realized that revisiting these scenes would not bring me the peace I was looking for. I didn't need anyone to admit anything. I needed, first of all, to stop lying to myself. The real confrontation began when I stopped justifying the unjustifiable, when I stopped softening memories to make them more acceptable. I looked at my story without trying to protect it from the right words, and that took more courage than any discussion I could have had. I confronted the idea that I should have been different, that it was my fault for not having reacted, for not having fled, for not having faced it. For the first time, I looked at the woman I was with honesty, not as someone weak, but as someone conditioned to survive emotionally. This internal confrontation was silent, but intense. There were days when I felt like going back, pretending that none of this mattered. It was more comfortable to stay in the old version of the story, but something in me no longer accepted that. I had seen too much to be able to unsee. When confronting myself, I had to abandon the image I created of myself in order to please. The woman is always strong, always correct, always understanding. Accepting that I too was hurt, confused, and silenced required me to let that armor fall. And without her, I felt vulnerable like never before. I also confronted the fear of being alone. For a long time, pleasing was my way of ensuring belonging. By stopping canceling myself, I ran the risk of no longer being needed. Accepting this possibility was difficult, but liberating. For the first time, I chose myself, even without guarantees. There were no screams or exaggerated tears. There was silence, reflection, and an intimate decision. I would not continue to treat myself as guilty. I wouldn't keep minimizing my pains to make others more comfortable. This commitment to myself was the most honest confrontation I have ever experienced. I realized that confronting others might even lighten momentarily, but it would not solve the emptiness I carried. What really needed to change was the way I saw myself. As long as I continued to cancel myself out internally, any external confrontation would be incomplete. This process brought me a strange calm. It was not happiness nor euphoria. It was a sense of alignment, as if, for the first time, I was whole with myself. Even with doubts, even with fear, I felt truer than ever. I also confronted time. I accepted that certain conversations would not happen, that some answers would not come, and surprisingly, it didn't destroy me. On the contrary, it gave me room to move forward without carrying impossible expectations. That chapter didn't end my story, but it redefined my role in it. I stopped being just someone who reacted to what came from outside. I became someone who chose, albeit belatedly, how I wanted to exist. I didn't confront anyone because I didn't need it anymore. The confrontation I owed had already happened. And by the end of it, I found something I'd never had before: respect for myself. I got here with more questions than answers, and that doesn't scare me like it used to. For a long time, I believed that I needed to have everything sorted out to move forward. Today, I understand that living is also walking with uncertainties, without losing oneself. Even late, it's still me. Not the molded version, not the one he liked, but the one that is finally beginning to recognize itself. The days are quieter now, but not in the same way as before. Silence is no longer a prison and has become a space. Space to think, feel, choose. I don't always know what I want, but I know better what I don't accept anymore. This difference, which seems small, has completely changed the way I place myself in the world. There was no visible transformation for those who look from the outside. I didn't radically change my life. I didn't break with everything. I didn't make announcements. The change was internal, discreet, but profound. I began to hear myself, to respect my limits, to allow my wishes to exist, even if they are not always met. I learned that pleasing is not loving, and that being silent is not synonymous with maturity. I spent years confusing these things and paying a high price for it. Today, when I realize that I'm about to cancel myself out again, I stop. I breathe. I wonder if this is choice or fear. This question alone gives me back a little bit of myself. There are times when sadness for what I have not experienced still appears. It comes without warning, especially when I think about the time that has passed. But now I don't run away from it. I accept. I understand that this sadness is part of the process of recognizing a story that was not light. It doesn't define me, but it reminds me of the value of being present now. I also discovered a different strength from the one I carried all my life. It is not the strength to endure everything in silence, but the strength to be honest with myself. This strength does not impress anyone, but it sustains me. It allows me to exist without having to prove anything. If I could talk to the woman I was, I wouldn't tell her it would have been different. I would just say that she did what she could, who survived the way he knew how, and that despite everything, there's still time to choose, even if that time is not long. Today, I do not seek reparations or explanations. I seek presence. I try to live the days I have with more truth, even if it means disappointing old expectations. I discovered that the biggest risk is not to displease others, but to continue abandoning myself. This story does not end with definitive answers or grandiose endings. It ends with a simple and continuous decision, not to erase myself anymore. Even though I still stumble, even if fear creeps in, I know now who I am, and that changes everything. If you who hear this story recognize yourself in some passage, know that it is not too late. Silence may last for years, but the truth does not lose its value over time. Some truths wait a lifetime to be told, and when they finally are, even late, they still matter. If something in this story touched you, share this video with someone who can recognize themselves in it. This is not just about an individual life, but about patterns of silence and adjustment that cut across families and generations. Sharing is an act of solidarity. Perhaps this message is the push someone needs to keep shutting up. I'll stay here reading every comment. Tell me from which city or country you're watching, and what part of that story stuck with you. What you write here really comes to me.